Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? Major Lily Viper Anderson sat in the back row of the squadron briefing room, watching 37 pairs of eyes deliberately avoid hers. The morning sun streamed through dusty windows at Aldafra Air Base, casting long shadows across a room thick with testosterone and unspoken judgment. She'd been here 6 months now. 6 months of flying ground attack missions, while her air-to-air combat qualifications gathered dust in some personnel file. 6 months of watching lesser pilots get the missions she'd trained her entire career to fly. But today felt different. Today, Colonel Brad "Thunder" Hayes stood at the front of the room with the kind of grave expression that meant someone was about to die. Intelligence has identified a squadron of 12 enemy fighters, Hayes began, clicking through satellite imagery on the overhead display. They're operating from a forward airfield 200 kilometers inside hostile territory. These aren't your typical adversaries. Lily leaned forward, studying the grainy photos. Sukhoi Su-35 flankers, advanced radar systems, long-range missiles. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from recognition. She'd been studying this enemy squadron for 3 months, analyzing their patterns, their tactics, their weaknesses. Every pilot in this room saw a threat. She saw a puzzle. More importantly, Hayes continued, they're being flown by experienced pilots trained specifically to counter American tactics. This squadron has been conducting hit-and-run strikes against our ground forces, then retreating to the safety of their heavily defended base. Captain Mike Hammer Rodriguez raised his hand. Sir, what's our mission profile? We're going to engage them in force. 2 full flights, 8 aircraft total. Objective: eliminate their air threat and degrade their ability to attack our ground forces. The room hummed with nervous energy. Lily felt something else entirely, a cold certainty that conventional tactics would fail. She'd read the after-action reports from 4 previous attempts, 4 missions, 4 failures, 4 aircraft lost, 2 pilots who would never come home. Major Tom "Snake" Williams leaned back in his chair with practiced nonchalance. Sir, how many times have we tried to engage this squadron? Hayes consulted his notes with the kind of diplomatic pause that said everything. 4 previous attempts. Results have been unsuccessful. Unsuccessful. Such a clean word for such messy deaths. Lily raised her hand. The simple gesture sent a ripple of barely concealed amusement through the room. She could feel their thoughts without hearing them. Here we go. The diversity hire wants to play with the big boys. Sir, I'd like to volunteer for this mission. The briefing room fell silent. Not the respectful silence of military protocol, but the awkward quiet of grown men trying not to laugh out loud. Then Captain Rodriguez started chuckling, a low, condescending sound that spread through the room like a virus. Colonel Hayes looked at her with the kind of patience usually reserved for children asking to drive the family car. Anderson, this isn't a training exercise. We're talking about 12 enemy fighters with experienced pilots who have been shooting down coalition aircraft for months. Maybe you should stick to ground attack missions. The suggestion drew more laughter from the assembled pilots. Lily felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. She'd felt this burn every day for 6 months. Every time they assigned her to close air support while sending less qualified pilots on air-to-air missions. Every time they treated her superior performance scores from fighter training like some kind of clerical error. Sir, with respect, I believe I can handle the mission. Major Williams turned around in his seat, studying her like a specimen under glass. Viper, no offense, but this is going to be a knife fight. These guys are aggressive, experienced, and they're flying aircraft that outperform our F-16s in several key areas. This isn't about flying skills. It's about being willing to get close and personal with people who want to kill you. People who want to kill you. As if she hadn't spent 340 combat hours over 3 Middle Eastern deployments dodging surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft fire. as if wanting to kill her was somehow new. "I understand the mission parameters, sir." Captain Jake Razor Phillips joined the conversation with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. "Viper, we've lost some good pilots to this squadron. These aren't rookie adversaries flying outdated equipment. They're combat veterans who know how to work together as a team." Good pilots. The implication hung in the air like smoke from burning aircraft. Good pilots had failed. What chance did she have? Hayes looked around the briefing room, nodding the skeptical expressions on his pilots' faces. Every expression told the same story. This is what happens when political correctness meets military reality. "Anderson, I appreciate your willingness to volunteer, but this mission requires our most experienced air-to-air specialists." The words hit like a physical blow. Most experienced. She'd graduated first in her class from fighter weapons school. First. Not second, not top 10%, first. She'd logged over 200 hours of air combat training. She'd been studying this specific enemy squadron for 3 months while these experienced pilots treated it like any other mission. But experience, apparently, was measured differently when you were 5'6" with auburn hair and hazel eyes. "Sir, I am an experienced air-to-air specialist. I graduated first in my class from fighter weapons school. I've logged over 200 hours of air combat training, and I've been studying the tactical patterns of this specific enemy squadron for 3 months. The room erupted again. This time the laughter wasn't even politely concealed. "Studying tactical patterns," Rodriguez shook his head. "Viper, this isn't an academic exercise. When you're in a merge with multiple bogeys trying to kill you, all that book learning goes out the window." Book learning. As if tactical analysis was somehow less valuable than whatever testosterone-fueled mystique these pilots thought they possessed. As if understanding your enemy was a sign of weakness rather than the foundation of victory. Lily remained calm despite the condescending tone washing over her like acid rain. "Actually, sir, I believe understanding enemy tactical patterns is exactly what gives you an advantage in multi-threat environments." Hayes held up his hand to quiet the discussion. The gesture was sharp, final. "Anderson, the mission is assigned to Williams and Rodriguez flights. You'll remain on ground alert for defensive operations." Ground alert. The military equivalent of sitting at the kids' table during Thanksgiving dinner. "Sir, I request permission to brief my tactical analysis of the enemy squadron." "That won't be necessary." But it was necessary. It was desperately, critically necessary, because she'd seen something in those patterns that these experienced pilots had missed. Something that could mean the difference between mission success and more empty beds in the barracks. "Sir, I believe I've identified vulnerabilities in their formation tactics that could be exploited by a single aircraft." Major Williams turned to face her completely, his expression shifting from condescension to outright disbelief. "A single aircraft. Viper, these guys fly in mutually supporting pairs with coordinated engagement zones. No single fighter can take on their entire squadron." No single fighter. The words echoed with the certainty of conventional wisdom, the kind of certainty that had gotten 4 aircraft shot down in 4 previous missions. "Sir, I believe it's possible with the right approach." The briefing room erupted in outright laughter. Several pilots were shaking their heads, and Hayes looked like he was losing what remained of his patience. But there was something they didn't know. Something she discovered in those 3 months of studying enemy patterns while they dismissed her as a ground pounder playing academic games. The enemy's strength, their coordination, their mutual support, their numerical advantage, was also their greatest weakness. And she was the only one who'd figured out how to exploit it. The morning briefing ended with Lily exactly where she'd started, ignored, dismissed, and assigned to watch from the sidelines while less qualified pilots flew into a tactical disaster she could have prevented. But as she watched Hayes close his briefing folder and Williams gather his flight plans, she felt something harder than frustration settling in her chest. Determination. Because sometimes proving you belong doesn't start with permission. Sometimes it starts with being right when everyone else is catastrophically wrong. What she heard over the radio that afternoon would haunt her for years. Lily sat in the squadron operations center, monitoring the mission from a bank of communication equipment that turned distant death into static-filled voices. The tactical display showed 8 blue dots representing coalition aircraft flying northwest toward the enemy airfield in perfect textbook formation. Everything about the mission profile screamed conventional wisdom, the kind that had already failed 4 times. But she listened anyway, because she had to know, had to witness what happened when pride and prejudice met tactical reality at 500 miles per hour. Hammer flight, this is Hammer 1. Contact bearing 340 for 80 miles, multiple groups. The first transmission came in calm and professional. Standard fighter pilot cool. But Lily had studied enough engagements to recognize the subtle tension underneath the practiced composure. Hammer 1 snake flight. We're showing the same contacts. Looks like they're launching their entire squadron. 12 enemy fighters. Exactly what intelligence had predicted, but not how they'd predicted it. The enemy squadron wasn't maintaining defensive positions near their airfield. They weren't waiting for the coalition aircraft to approach within range of their ground-based defenses. They were launching offensively, aggressively, with their entire force. Lily watched the tactical display with growing dread. The enemy aircraft were positioning themselves for the kind of coordinated engagement that would maximize their numerical advantage against the smaller American force. Everything about their formation screamed tactical sophistication that intelligence had missed and the mission planners had underestimated. Hammer flight, snake flight. Recommend we maintain current formation and engage with AMRAAMs at maximum range. Snake 1, Hammer 1. Concur. Lock up multiple targets and fire when in range. Standard beyond visual range tactics. Exactly the kind of predictable approach that the enemy squadron had been countering for months. Lily wanted to scream into the radio, to warn them that they were flying into a tactical trap that had been specifically designed to neutralize their advantages. But she was just the ground alert pilot, the diversity hire, the academic with book learning and no real-world experience. Hammer 1, Snake 1. I'm showing multiple missile launches, 12, possibly 16 inbound AMRAAMs. The calm professionalism cracked slightly. 16 missiles against 8 aircraft. The enemy had launched coordinated salvos designed to overwhelm the coalition pilots' defensive capabilities. Snake 1, Hammer 1. I count 14 missiles inbound, all aircraft defensive maneuvers, dispense chaff and flare. The radio transmissions became increasingly frantic as the mission devolved from textbook engagement to desperate survival. The enemy squadron wasn't just numerically superior, they were tactically superior, using coordination and situational awareness that consistently outmaneuvered conventional American fighter tactics. Hammer 3 is hit. Hammer 3 is going down. The first casualty came through the radio like a physical blow. Somewhere over hostile territory, an F-16 was falling out of the sky, taking with it a pilot who'd laughed at her tactical analysis just hours earlier. Snake 4, I've got multiple missiles tracking. I can't shake them. Panic, raw, unfiltered terror bleeding through military radio discipline. These were experienced combat pilots facing an enemy that had anticipated their every move and prepared countermeasures for their every tactic. All aircraft, this is an emergency. We are being overwhelmed. Request immediate support. But there was no support to give. The nearest coalition fighters were hundreds of miles away. The surface-to-air missile sites were still operational. The enemy squadron had achieved exactly what they'd intended, tactical isolation of a smaller American force that had flown directly into their strength. Within 10 minutes, the mission had turned into a disaster that validated every concern Lily had tried to voice. 3 coalition aircraft shot down, 5 others retreating with battle damage and depleted missile inventories. The enemy squadron still operational and now emboldened by their success. Colonel Hayes's voice crackled through the operations center radio, with the kind of exhaustion that aged a man years in minutes. "Control, this is Thunder. Mission unsuccessful. Multiple aircraft lost. We're returning to base." Mission unsuccessful. There was that diplomatic language again. Clean words for messy reality. 3 pilots were missing, captured, killed, or worse. The enemy squadron was not only intact but had demonstrated tactical superiority that would make future engagements even more dangerous. Lily had been right about the enemy tactics. She'd predicted this failure with mathematical precision, but being right brought no satisfaction when the cost was measured in empty beds and folded flags. When the surviving aircraft returned to Aldafra, the debriefing was somber and intense. Hayes looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of a few hours. The swagger that had filled the morning briefing room had been replaced by the hollow-eyed reality of tactical defeat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility, "we just got our asses handed to us by an enemy force that was better prepared and better coordinated than our intelligence indicated." Major Williams, whose flight had lost 2 aircraft, was visibly shaken. The cocky confidence that had dismissed her concerns now seemed like arrogance from another lifetime. "Sir, they knew exactly what we were going to do. It was like they'd read our tactical manual and planned specifically to counter our approach." "How is that possible?" Rodriguez asked. The question hung in the air like an indictment. How was it possible that American pilots flying advanced aircraft with superior training had been so thoroughly outfought by an enemy they'd underestimated? "Because," Lily said quietly from the back of the room, "they have been countering our approach." Every head turned toward her. The same pilots who dismissed her that morning now looked at her with something approaching desperation. The academic with book learning suddenly seemed like the only person in the room who understood what had just happened. For 3 months, they've been engaging coalition aircraft using the same tactics we employed today. They've had time to study our methods and develop countermeasures. Hayes studied her face with new attention. "Anderson, you said you'd been studying their tactical patterns. What did you observe?" Finally, the question she'd been waiting to answer for 3 months. The opportunity to share analysis that might prevent more pilots from dying in predictable tactical disasters. But as she moved to the front of the briefing room, Lily felt the weight of what came next. Proving she was right meant admitting that the mission could have been prevented, that 3 pilots had died because conventional wisdom was sometimes conventionally wrong. And sometimes being the only one who saw the truth was the loneliest position in the world. Could one pilot really take on 12 enemy fighters and survive? The question seemed impossible when Lily posed it to a room full of experienced combat pilots who just witnessed the tactical superiority of the enemy squadron. But impossibility, she'd learned, was often just another word for untested assumptions. "Sir," she said, moving to the tactical display at the front of the briefing room, "the enemy squadron has been using a consistent approach for their defensive operations. They maintain 4 aircraft on ground alert, launch in response to incoming threats, and use their numerical advantage to overwhelm smaller coalition formations." She clicked through several slides showing enemy aircraft positions from previous engagements. Each pattern revealed the same tactical doctrine, coordinated mutual support, designed to maximize their advantages against conventional American fighter tactics. But today, they changed their tactics. Instead of launching defensively, they launched offensively with their entire squadron. They positioned themselves for a coordinated missile engagement that maximized their firepower advantage. Major Williams, still processing the loss of 2 aircraft from his flight, looked up from his hands. Why would they change their tactics? Because they've learned that our standard approach is to engage with 2 4-ship formations using beyond visual range missiles. They've developed countermeasures that neutralize our tactical advantages and exploit our weaknesses. The room was quiet now, not the dismissive quiet of morning arrogance, but the focused attention of professionals trying to understand how they'd been so thoroughly defeated. Hayes studied the tactical display. Anderson, you said you believed a single aircraft could take on their entire squadron. How? The question she'd been preparing to answer for 3 months. The tactical analysis that had consumed her off-duty hours and filled her thoughts during countless ground alert shifts, while other pilots flew the missions she'd trained her entire career to handle. Sir, the enemy's strength is their coordination and numerical advantage. But that coordination also creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by unconventional tactics. She pulled up a detailed analysis of enemy formation patterns, charts and graphs that represented hours of study, while others had dismissed her as an academic playing war games. They fly in mutually supporting pairs with each pair responsible for a specific engagement zone, but their coordination requires constant communication and adherence to predetermined flight paths. A single aircraft operating alone can disrupt their coordination by forcing them to react to unpredictable maneuvers. Captain Phillips looked skeptical. Viper, that sounds like a good way to get yourself shot down by 12 different aircraft. Not if you approach it correctly, Lily replied. The key is understanding that 12 aircraft operating as a coordinated unit are actually more predictable than 12 aircraft operating independently. The concept challenged everything these pilots had been taught about air combat. Numerical superiority was supposed to be decisive. Coordination was supposed to be advantageous. But Lily had identified the hidden weakness in their greatest strength. Hayes considered her analysis. Anderson, explain your tactical approach. She clicked to a slide showing her proposed flight plan, a route that avoided enemy strengths and exploited their dependencies. Sir, instead of engaging the enemy squadron where they expect to fight, at medium altitude with beyond visual range missiles, I would approach at very low altitude using terrain masking to avoid early detection. Go on. Once I reach their operational area, I would use hit-and-run tactics to engage individual pairs while avoiding their coordinated response. The goal isn't to engage their entire formation simultaneously. It's to force them to break formation and react to threats they can't predict. Williams was shaking his head. Viper, the moment you fire your first missile, every aircraft in their squadron is going to be hunting you. You'll be outnumbered 12-1. Not if I use the right approach, Lily replied. 12 aircraft searching for 1 aircraft that's operating unpredictably are actually at a disadvantage. They'll be forced to spread out their search pattern, which breaks their mutual support and makes them vulnerable to individual engagement. The concept was counterintuitive, almost heretical to conventional fighter doctrine. But it was based on detailed analysis of enemy patterns and a clear understanding of how their tactical advantages could become tactical vulnerabilities. Hayes looked around the briefing room at pilots who were beginning to grasp the implications of what she was proposing. Gentlemen, we just lost 3 aircraft and 3 pilots using conventional tactics. At this point, I'm willing to consider unconventional approaches. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Sir, are we seriously considering sending 1 pilot against an entire enemy squadron? I'm considering whether Major Anderson's analysis might be correct about the vulnerabilities in their tactical approach. Lily sensed the opportunity she'd been waiting for, not just to fly the mission she'd trained for, but to prove that tactical thinking could overcome numerical disadvantage, that understanding your enemy was more valuable than matching their firepower. Sir, if you'll allow me to brief my complete tactical plan, I believe I can demonstrate how this approach could be successful. Hayes checked his watch. The afternoon was wearing on, and every hour of delay gave the enemy squadron more time to adapt to their morning success. Anderson, you have 15 minutes. 15 minutes to prove that impossible missions were just missions that nobody had figured out how to accomplish yet. She'd been preparing this briefing for months, hopping for exactly this opportunity. Every detail had been rehearsed, every question anticipated, every objection prepared for with additional analysis and supporting data. The enemy squadron operates from a forward airfield with limited radar coverage, she began, pulling up detailed terrain maps and radar coverage analyses. By approaching from the southeast at very low altitude, I can reach their operational area without being detected by their early warning systems. The briefing continued with mathematical precision. Radar cross-sections and detection ranges, terrain masking and electronic countermeasures, performance advantages of the F-16 in specific flight regimes that the enemy might not expect or counter effectively. Once I'm in position, I'll engage their defensive patrols using vertical tactics that exploit the performance advantages of the F-16 in high-G maneuvering. Vertical tactics, Williams asked. Using altitude and energy management to control engagement geometry. The Su-35 is a capable aircraft, but it's designed for horizontal maneuvering. The F-16 has advantages in vertical combat that can be exploited with the right tactics. Lily continued her briefing, explaining how she would use surprise, superior tactics, and the F-16's unique capabilities to engage individual enemy aircraft while avoiding their coordinated response. The key was never engaging more than 2 aircraft at a time, and never remaining in one location long enough for them to coordinate an effective response. Hayes studied her tactical plan with the intensity of a commander weighing lives against mission objectives. Anderson, this is extremely high-risk flying. If something goes wrong, we won't be able to provide support. Sir, I understand the risks, but I believe this approach has a higher probability of success than conventional tactics. The briefing room was quiet as the assembled pilots considered her proposal. It was unconventional, dangerous, and completely different from anything they'd been trained to do. But it was also logical, well-planned, and based on a detailed understanding of enemy capabilities and limitations. More importantly, it was the only plan that offered hope of success against an enemy that had proven superior to conventional approaches. Hayes made the decision that would define the rest of Lily's career. Anderson, you have authorization to attempt this mission, but I want detailed abort criteria and constant communication throughout the engagement. Yes, sir. And Anderson, if this doesn't work, if you can't accomplish the mission objectives or if the risks become unacceptable, I want you to disengage immediately. We've already lost 3 pilots today. I don't want to lose a 4th. Authorization granted. Mission approved. The opportunity she'd trained her entire career for, finally within reach. But as the briefing room emptied and Lily began her mission preparation, she felt the weight of what came next. 12 enemy fighters with experienced pilots and advanced aircraft. 1 F-16 with superior tactics and a pilot who had something to prove. The mathematics were simple. The reality would be anything but. Why was she flying alone into hostile airspace at dawn? The question echoed in Lily's mind as her F-16 skimmed through mountain valleys at 500 feet, terrain masking her approach from enemy radar systems that were already searching for coalition aircraft. The pre-dawn darkness provided additional concealment, but in 2 hours the sun would be high enough to eliminate her visual camouflage. She had 500 rounds of 20 ammunition for her internal cannon and 6 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. Against 12 enemy fighters, the mathematics were stark. Each shot had to count, each maneuver had to be perfect, each decision had to be instantaneous and correct. The flight to the target area took 90 minutes of precision flying through valleys and around mountain peaks that provided concealment from enemy surveillance. Every radar warning receiver tone, every radio transmission, every shadow on the ground could indicate detection and mission failure. But as she approached the enemy operational area, Lily felt something she hadn't expected: calm. Not the absence of fear, she understood the risks better than anyone, but the focused clarity that came from months of preparation meeting moment of execution. Her tactical plan was sound. Her aircraft was functioning perfectly. Her weapons systems were ready. Most importantly, she was flying alone, which meant no coordination requirements, no communication protocols, no mutual support dependencies that could be exploited by an enemy that specialized in countering coordinated American tactics. For the first time in her career, her greatest perceived weakness, being alone, was actually her greatest tactical advantage. The first engagement came 20 minutes after she'd entered enemy airspace. Two Su-35 flankers launched from the enemy airfield to investigate reports of unknown aircraft in the region. Standard defensive response to potential threats, exactly what she'd predicted based on 3 months of pattern analysis. Unknown aircraft, unknown aircraft. This is coalition fighter. You are in restricted airspace. Identify yourself or you will be fired upon. The radio call was standard intercept protocol, but Lily could hear the confidence in the enemy pilot's voice. He'd been flying these missions for months, engaging coalition aircraft with superior tactics and numerical advantage. He expected another routine victory against predictable American fighter doctrine. Coalition aircraft, you are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now or be destroyed. The response came in accented English with the kind of calm professionalism that indicated genuine tactical confidence. These weren't rookie pilots flying outdated equipment. They were combat veterans who had proven their superiority against 4 previous American missions. But they had never faced tactics specifically designed to exploit their coordination-dependent fighting style. Lily didn't respond to the radio calls. Instead, she used her radar to identify the 2 enemy aircraft approaching from the northwest at medium altitude, flying in the standard mutually supporting formation that she'd studied extensively. They were searching for her at their altitude, expecting to engage another coalition formation using conventional beyond visual range tactics. They weren't prepared for a single aircraft approaching from below, using the F-16's superior climbing ability to gain altitude advantage while remaining undetected. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. Lily approached the enemy aircraft from below and behind, using her altitude advantage to launch 2 AMRAAM missiles at close range before the enemy pilots knew they were under attack. The first missile destroyed the lead aircraft in a brilliant flash of high explosive that illuminated the pre-dawn sky. The second missile eliminated his wingman as he attempted to maneuver defensively, his aircraft disintegrating under the impact of advanced American ordnance. 2 down, 10 to go. Lily immediately dove back to low altitude to avoid the radar scans that would inevitably follow the missile launches. The enemy squadron's response was exactly what she'd predicted. They launched their entire remaining force and began searching for the coalition fighter that had just eliminated 2 of their aircraft. But she was already repositioning for her next engagement, using terrain masking and electronic countermeasures to remain undetected, while the enemy pilots searched the wrong area for threats that were no longer there. The second engagement came 15 minutes later, when she intercepted another enemy patrol that had been vectored to investigate the location of the first air-to-air kills. This time, the enemy pilots were more alert and better prepared for the possibility of combat, but they were still using the same formation tactics that made them vulnerable to her unconventional approach. She eliminated both aircraft with cannon fire, using high-G maneuvering to position herself for deflection shots that the enemy pilots couldn't counter with their horizontal maneuvering tactics. The F-16's superior vertical performance allowed her to control engagement geometry in ways that their Su-35s couldn't match. 4 down, 8 to go. The pattern continued for the next hour. Hit-and-run tactics against individual enemy formations, eliminating aircraft with missiles or cannon fire before disengaging and repositioning for the next attack. Each engagement was different, requiring her to adapt her tactics to specific conditions and enemy reactions, but the overall approach remained consistent. Use surprise and superior tactics to engage enemy aircraft individually, while avoiding their coordinated response. By 800 hours, she had eliminated 8 enemy aircraft without taking any battle damage or expending more than half of her available ammunition. The impossible mission was becoming a tactical masterpiece, proving that understanding your enemy was more valuable than matching their firepower. But the final 4 aircraft would be the most dangerous. The surviving enemy pilots had finally adapted to her tactics and were now flying in a tight, mutually supporting formation that would be difficult to break up with individual attacks. They had also moved to higher altitude, where they could use their radar systems more effectively to search for the coalition fighter that had been systematically destroying their squadron. Lily knew that her hit-and-run tactics wouldn't work against the disciplined formation that the surviving enemy pilots had adopted. She would need to engage all 4 aircraft simultaneously, using tactics that would allow her to survive in a traditional dogfight while eliminating multiple threats. The decision required everything she'd learned about air combat, plus tactical innovations she'd never attempted in training. 4 experienced enemy pilots flying advanced aircraft, coordinating their attacks against a single F-16 that was outnumbered but not outfought. She climbed to 25,000 feet and approached the enemy formation head-on, using the F-16's small radar cross-section and electronic countermeasures to delay detection until she was within missile range. The final engagement was the most intense air combat of her career. 12 minutes of high-G maneuvering, precision gunnery, and split-second tactical decisions that covered over 100 square miles of hostile airspace. Energy management and vertical tactics, situational awareness and weapons employment. Every skill she'd ever developed, pushed to absolute limits against an enemy that refused to yield. When it was over, 4 more enemy aircraft had been destroyed, and Lily was flying alone in airspace that had been completely cleared of hostile fighters. Control, this is Viper. Mission accomplished. 12 enemy aircraft destroyed. No friendly casualties, returning to base. The radio silence lasted for several seconds before Hayes's voice crackled through the static. Viper Control, confirm 12 enemy aircraft destroyed. Confirmed, sir. The enemy squadron has been eliminated. Outstanding work, Viper. See you when you get home. The flight back to Aldafra gave Lily time to process what had just happened. She'd accomplished something that everyone had said was impossible, using tactics that no one had believed would work. More importantly, she'd eliminated a threat that had been killing coalition pilots for months. But the real victory wasn't tactical, it was personal. She'd proven that excellence had no gender limitations, and that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought against foreign enemies in distant skies. Sometimes they were won against assumptions and prejudices that prevented good people from contributing everything they were capable of giving. What was waiting for her when she landed? The entire 347th Fighter Squadron stood on the flight line at Aldafra Air Base, watching a single F-16 approach from the northwest, carrying a pilot who had just accomplished the impossible. Word had spread quickly through the base. Major Lily Viper Anderson had engaged and destroyed an entire enemy squadron in single combat. As she taxied toward the squadron area, Lily could see faces she recognized. Pilots who had dismissed her tactical analysis, questioned her capabilities, and suggested she stick to ground attack missions. Colonel Hayes was there, along with Williams, Rodriguez, Phillips, and every other pilot who had doubted that a female fighter pilot could handle air-to-air combat. But their expressions had changed. The condescending smiles and barely concealed skepticism had been replaced by something she'd never seen directed at her before: genuine respect. "Viper," Hayes said as she climbed out of her aircraft, "that was the most incredible flying I've ever seen. You just accomplished something that an entire squadron couldn't do." The words carried weight beyond simple praise. Hayes was acknowledging not just her tactical success, but the failure of conventional wisdom that had dismissed her capabilities based on preconceptions rather than evidence. "Sir, I had the advantage of studying their tactics and developing a specific approach for this threat." Williams stepped forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by humility that came from witnessing tactical brilliance he couldn't have imagined. "Viper, I owe you an apology. What you just did wasn't just exceptional flying. It was exceptional tactical thinking. You saw weaknesses that none of us recognized." The admission meant more than he could know. Williams had been the most vocal critic of her capabilities, the pilot most convinced that air-to-air combat required qualities that women didn't possess. His apology acknowledged that excellence was measured by results, not gender. Rodriguez nodded with the kind of professional respect that couldn't be faked. "You proved that air combat isn't about aggression or killer instinct. It's about understanding your enemy and using superior tactics to exploit their vulnerabilities." Phillips extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Viper, you just earned the respect of every pilot in this squadron. That was the most professional display of air-to-air combat any of us have ever witnessed." But the recognition that mattered most came from Hayes, who approached her privately after the crowd had dispersed. His expression carried the gravity of a commander who understood the implications of what had just happened. "Anderson, I want to apologize for my comments yesterday. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on preconceptions that had nothing to do with your actual skills." "Sir, I understand. The squadron had legitimate concerns about my experience level." "No," Hayes said firmly. "It wasn't about experience. It was about gender, and that was wrong. What you accomplished today proves that tactical thinking and superior flying skills matter more than any other factor in air combat." He paused, studying her face with the kind of attention he should have given her tactical analysis months earlier. "I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I'm requesting that you be assigned to develop new air combat tactics for the entire wing." The conversation represented more than career advancement. It was acknowledgement that her success had implications beyond individual achievement, that it challenged assumptions about female capabilities in combat roles and opened opportunities for future female pilots. 6 months later, Lily was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Air Force Weapons School, where she developed the curriculum for what became known as Anderson Tactics, unconventional air combat techniques designed to allow individual aircraft to engage numerically superior enemy forces. Her techniques were eventually adopted throughout the Air Force and incorporated into pilot training programs worldwide. But more importantly, her success had demonstrated that women could not only handle air-to-air combat, but could innovate and excel in ways that redefined what was possible for fighter aircraft operations. The classroom where she taught future fighter pilots was filled with eager faces, both male and female, learning tactics that challenged conventional wisdom about air combat. Her students included pilots who would go on to fly combat missions around the world, carrying her innovations into conflicts where tactical superiority meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The most important lesson from this mission, Lily would tell her students, wasn't about flying techniques or tactical procedures. It was about the importance of questioning conventional wisdom when that wisdom is based on assumptions rather than evidence. She clicked to a slide showing the tactical analysis that had made her mission possible, charts and graphs that represented months of study, while others had dismissed her as an academic playing war games. Every limitation that people placed on my capabilities was based on preconceptions about gender rather than objective assessment of my skills and knowledge. When I proved those preconceptions wrong, it opened opportunities not just for me, but for every female pilot who came after me. One of her students, a young female pilot fresh from flight training, raised her hand with the kind of nervous determination that Lily remembered from her own early career. "Ma'am, how do you deal with people who question your capabilities based on your gender?" Lily smiled with the kind of understanding that came from walking the same difficult path. "Lieutenant, the best way to deal with skepticism is to prove it wrong through superior performance. When you consistently demonstrate that you can accomplish missions that others can't, gender becomes irrelevant." Another student, this one male, raised his hand. "But what if you're never given the opportunity to prove yourself?" "Then you create the opportunity. You study harder, train longer, and prepare more thoroughly than anyone expects. When the mission comes that requires exactly your skills and knowledge, you'll be ready to exceed every expectation." The female lieutenant nodded, but her expression showed she understood the deeper challenge. "Ma'am, what would you tell female pilots who are facing the same kind of skepticism you encountered?" Lily considered the question with the gravity it deserved. These weren't just tactical inquiries. They were requests for guidance from young women following a path that she had helped create, but that still required courage to walk. "I would tell them that every barrier that has ever been broken was broken by someone who refused to accept that the barrier was permanent. The people who say women can't handle air-to-air combat aren't evaluating your capabilities. They're revealing their own limitations." The classroom was quiet as her students processed the implications of what she was saying. Military aviation remained a challenging field for women, despite the successes that pioneers like Lily had achieved. Each female pilot still faced questions about her capabilities, her commitment, and her ability to perform under pressure. But they also had something that Lily hadn't possessed during her early career: proof that it was possible. Living evidence that excellence transcended gender limitations and that tactical thinking could overcome any numerical disadvantage. Years later, when Lily had risen to the rank of brigadier general and was serving as commander of an entire fighter wing, she would look back on that mission as the moment when her career truly began. Not because it was the first time she'd proven her flying skills, but because it was the first time she'd been given the opportunity to demonstrate that gender was irrelevant to tactical excellence. Her office walls displayed the usual collection of military memorabilia: squadron patches, photographs from various deployments, commendations from grateful commanders. But the item she valued most was a simple framed photograph from that morning at Al-Dafra Air Base, showing her climbing out of an F-16 while her squadron mates looked on with expressions of genuine respect. The photograph captured a moment that represented more than individual achievement. It documented the instant when preconceptions met reality and lost, when conventional wisdom encountered tactical innovation and was forced to adapt, when gender became irrelevant in the face of superior performance. But perhaps most importantly, it preserved a moment when impossible became possible through preparation, determination, and the courage to prove that limitations exist only in the minds of people who accept them without question. The young pilots she commanded now, both male and female, took for granted opportunities that she had fought to create. Female fighter pilots flew combat missions without having to justify their presence or prove their capabilities to skeptical squadron mates. They were evaluated based on their performance, not their gender. That progress represented the real victory from that morning over hostile airspace. Not the tactical success against 12 enemy fighters, but the strategic triumph against assumptions and prejudices that had limited human potential based on irrelevant characteristics. Why did the mission matter beyond the tactical victory? The question haunted Lily during quiet moments in her later career, when she had time to reflect on the broader implications of what had happened that morning over enemy territory. 12 aircraft destroyed, one pilot vindicated, but the real impact extended far beyond individual achievement or tactical success. In military briefing rooms around the world, her mission had become a case study in unconventional tactics and innovative thinking. Staff colleges taught courses on Anderson tactics, analyzing how she had identified enemy vulnerabilities that conventional wisdom had missed and exploited them with techniques that challenged decades of fighter doctrine. But the lessons extended beyond military tactics into questions of human potential and institutional barriers that prevented capable people from contributing their best efforts. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one flying advanced aircraft with superior numbers, Lily would tell audiences of military leaders and corporate executives who invited her to speak about leadership and innovation. It's the one that lives in our own assumptions about what's possible and who's capable of achieving it. The analogy resonated because it applied to more than military aviation. Every industry, every profession, every organization had its own version of the briefing room where certain people were dismissed based on characteristics that had nothing to do with their capabilities or potential contributions. Her story became a lens through which people examined their own biases and preconceptions. How many talented individuals had been relegated to ground alert roles because their leaders couldn't see past irrelevant differences? How many innovative solutions had been dismissed because they came from unexpected sources? The questions were uncomfortable because they required honest self-examination of decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but looked different when examined through the perspective of actual results rather than assumed limitations. Lily's success had proven that tactical thinking could overcome numerical disadvantage, but it had also demonstrated something more fundamental, that excellence existed in places where conventional wisdom didn't expect to find it. The female pilots who followed her into combat roles carried that lesson forward. They flew missions over Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other conflict zones where American air power was engaged. Some achieved ace status by shooting down multiple enemy aircraft. Others became squadron commanders, wing commanders, and general officers who shaped military aviation policy. Their collective success created a feedback loop that challenged broader assumptions about gender roles in combat. If women could excel in air-to-air combat, traditionally considered the most demanding and aggressive form of military aviation, then what other limitations were based on prejudice rather than evidence? The question rippled through military culture and beyond, influencing policy decisions about combat exclusions, special operations units, and leadership positions that had been restricted based on gender assumptions rather than objective qualifications. But perhaps the most important impact was on young women who saw Lily's story and realized that their own dreams weren't limited by other people's expectations. Girls who had been told that certain careers were unsuitable for women found role models who had proven otherwise through superior performance and tactical innovation. The pipeline of female military aviators expanded dramatically in the years following her mission. Flight training programs that had struggled to attract qualified female candidates suddenly had waiting lists of young women eager to prove their capabilities in the cockpit. Corporate boardrooms began asking similar questions about their own talent utilization. If the military, historically one of the most traditional and male-dominated institutions, could recognize and reward female excellence in combat roles, what excuse did civilian organizations have for maintaining barriers based on outdated assumptions? The conversation expanded beyond gender to include other characteristics that had been used to limit human potential: age, background, education, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and countless other factors that had nothing to do with capability, but everything to do with conventional expectations about who belonged in certain roles. Lily's tactical victory over 12 enemy fighters had become a strategic triumph over the more pervasive enemy of assumed limitations. Her success proved that excellence was distributed more broadly than conventional wisdom recognized, and that organizations succeeded when they evaluated people based on performance rather than preconceptions. But the lesson that resonated most deeply was about the importance of preparation meeting opportunity. Lily had spent months studying enemy patterns while others dismissed her analysis. She had trained extensively in tactics that challenged conventional doctrine, while others relied on tried-and-true methods. When the moment came that required exactly her skills and knowledge, she was ready. Not just ready to fly the mission, but ready to exceed every expectation and accomplish something that everyone had considered impossible. That preparation opportunity intersection became a model for others facing similar challenges. Success wasn't just about being in the right place at the right time. It was about being prepared to recognize opportunities that others missed and having the skills necessary to capitalize on them when they appeared. The story became particularly powerful because it avoided the trap of depicting success as effortless or natural. Lily hadn't succeeded because she was inherently better than her male counterparts, but because she had worked harder to understand the specific challenge they were facing and had developed innovative solutions that conventional approaches had missed. Her example showed that barriers could be overcome through superior preparation, tactical thinking, and the courage to attempt missions that others considered impossible. But it also demonstrated that systemic change required more than individual achievement. It required institutional leaders willing to recognize excellence regardless of its source and create opportunities for capable people to demonstrate their potential. What legacy did that single mission create? 25 years later, Colonel Sarah Phoenix Martinez climbed into an F-35 Lightning II at Nellis Air Force Base, preparing for a mission that would have been unthinkable during Lily's early career. As squadron commander of the 65th Aggressor Squadron, Martinez was responsible for developing tactics that would challenge the next generation of American fighter pilots. Her call sign honored both her heritage and her reputation for rising from tactical defeats to achieve mission success. But her position existed because of pathways that pioneers like Lily Anderson had carved through institutional resistance and cultural barriers. The briefing room where Martinez addressed her pilots looked similar to the one where Lily had volunteered for her impossible mission decades earlier. But the faces in the audience told a different story: 30% female, representing dozens of countries, ethnicities, and backgrounds that reflected the global nature of modern military aviation. Today we're going to discuss unconventional tactics for engaging numerically superior enemy forces. Martinez began, clicking to a slide that displayed the official Air Force doctrine designation: Anderson Tactics, Asymmetric Engagement Protocols. The techniques that Lily had improvised during her solo mission against 12 enemy fighters had been refined, systematized, and incorporated into standard pilot training curricula. What had seemed impossible to conventional wisdom in 2025 had become routine tactical knowledge by 2050. But the deeper impact extended far beyond military doctrine. The cultural shift that Lily's success had accelerated had transformed not just aviation, but entire approaches to talent identification, development, and utilization across multiple sectors. The corporate executive who asked unconventional questions during strategy meetings was following a pattern that echoed Lilly's tactical analysis. The startup founder who identified market vulnerabilities that established competitors had missed was applying principles similar to those that had allowed one F-16 to defeat an entire enemy squadron. Innovation itself had become more inclusive because organizations had learned that breakthrough thinking often came from perspectives that conventional wisdom hadn't expected or valued. The outsider's view, once dismissed as inexperience, was now recognized as a source of tactical advantage. Lilly's story had become required reading in leadership development programs, not because of the specific military context, but because of the universal principles it illustrated about human potential, institutional barriers, and the courage required to challenge assumptions that limited performance. Business schools taught case studies that analyzed how she had identified patterns that experienced professionals had missed, developed solutions that challenged conventional approaches, and executed strategies that required perfect performance under extreme pressure. The narrative resonated because it avoided simplistic heroism in favor of demonstrable excellence achieved through preparation, analysis, and tactical innovation. It showed that success came from understanding challenges more deeply than others and being willing to attempt solutions that stretched beyond comfortable limitations. But perhaps most importantly, it had changed the conversation about who belonged in demanding roles and what qualities were necessary for success under pressure. The assumption that certain characteristics predetermine performance capabilities had been replaced by evidence-based evaluation of actual skills and achievements. The transformation was visible in aviation academies, where female cadets composed nearly half of each graduating class, in special operations units where gender had become irrelevant to selection criteria, and in corporate leadership positions where diversity was valued not as a social goal, but as a tactical advantage. Young people growing up in this changed environment couldn't imagine the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. The idea that someone's gender, background, or unconventional approach might disqualify them from pursuing demanding careers seemed as outdated as assuming that women couldn't handle the physical demands of flying high-performance aircraft. But the transformation hadn't been automatic or easy. Each generation had faced its own version of the briefing room, where conventional wisdom questioned capabilities and dismissed innovative approaches. Progress had required countless individuals willing to prepare thoroughly, perform excellently, and challenge assumptions through superior results rather than argumentative rhetoric. Lilly's tactical manual, updated through multiple editions as technology and threats evolved, remained the definitive guide for asymmetric air combat. But her strategic legacy was the institutional culture change that made exceptional performance more important than comfortable conformity. The memorial wall at the Air Force Academy displayed photographs and biographical summaries of aviation pioneers who had expanded the boundaries of what was considered possible. Lilly's entry focused not on the tactical details of her impossible mission, but on its broader significance. Major Lilly Viper Anderson proved that excellence transcends preconceptions and that tactical innovation can overcome any numerical disadvantage. Her success challenged assumptions about human potential and opened opportunities for future generations of military aviators, regardless of gender, background, or conventional expectations about who belonged in demanding roles. The inscription concluded with a quote from her final lecture to Air Force Academy cadets before retirement. "The most dangerous limitations are the ones we accept without testing. Every barrier that has ever been broken was broken by someone who refused to believe that impossible was permanent." Standing in that memorial hallway, reading those words carved in granite, Visitors understood that the 12 enemy aircraft she had destroyed were just the beginning of her victory. The real triumph had been against the more pervasive enemies of assumed limitations and institutional barriers that prevented capable people from contributing their full potential. That victory continued every day in briefing rooms, corporate boardrooms, research laboratories, and anywhere else that human potential was being evaluated based on evidence rather than assumptions. The tactical lessons from her mission had been incorporated into military doctrine, but the strategic lessons had become part of how society thought about capability, opportunity, and the courage required to prove that impossible was just another word for untested. Sometimes, the most important battles weren't fought against foreign enemies in distant skis. Sometimes they were won against the assumptions and prejudices that lived in human hearts and minds, limiting potential based on irrelevant characteristics rather than actual capabilities. And sometimes, when the world said something was impossible, all it took was one person with superior tactics and the determination to prove that impossible missions were just missions that nobody had figured out how to accomplish yet. What would she tell us about courage? In her final interview before retirement, Brigadier General Lily Anderson sat in her Pentagon office, surrounded by commendations, photographs, and artifacts from a career that had redefined what was possible in military aviation. The interviewer, a young journalist barely old enough to remember when female combat pilots were still controversial, asked the question that everyone wanted answered. General Anderson, what does real courage look like? Lily considered the question with the same thoughtful precision she had once applied to tactical analysis. Outside her window, aircraft approached Reagan National Airport in precise patterns that reflected decades of aviation innovation and safety protocols that had saved countless lives. Real courage, she said finally, isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite fear when action serves a purpose larger than personal comfort. She paused, her eyes focusing on something beyond the interviewer's shoulder, perhaps the memory of a pre-dawn briefing room where her capabilities had been questioned, or the moment when she had climbed alone into an F-16 to attempt a mission that everyone considered impossible. The morning I volunteered for that mission, I was afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of dying, afraid of proving right everyone who had said I didn't belong in that briefing room. But I was more afraid of watching other pilots die in tactical disasters that I might have been able to prevent. The distinction was crucial because it challenged popular mythology about fearless heroes accomplishing impossible feats through supernatural confidence. Lily's success had come from channeling natural human fear into focused preparation and tactical innovation, rather than pretending that fear didn't exist. Courage isn't about being unafraid, she continued. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway because the mission is more important than personal safety. It's about preparing so thoroughly that you can perform effectively despite fear, not because fear is absent. The lesson applied beyond military aviation to anyone facing situations where conventional wisdom said success was unlikely or impossible. The entrepreneur launching a startup that challenged established competitors. The scientist proposing theories that contradicted accepted doctrine. The artist creating work that didn't fit comfortable categories. All required the same fundamental courage. Willingness to risk failure in pursuit of something that conventional wisdom considered unlikely, but that careful analysis suggested might be achievable through superior preparation and tactical innovation. The most courageous thing I ever did, Lily said, wasn't flying alone against 12 enemy fighters. It was raising my hand in that briefing room when everyone expected me to stay quiet. It was volunteering for a mission when I knew that failure would confirm every negative assumption about my capabilities. That moment of volunteering represented a different kind of courage than the tactical bravery required during air combat. It was the courage of conviction, believing in her analysis strongly enough to risk career consequences and personal humiliation if she was wrong. "But you weren't wrong," the interviewer observed. "I couldn't know that for certain beforehand. My tactical analysis suggested that unconventional approaches might succeed where conventional tactics had failed, but analysis isn't certainty. Success required both good preparation and favorable circumstances during execution." The honesty was refreshing because it acknowledged the role that chance played in exceptional achievements while still emphasizing the importance of preparation and tactical thinking. Success wasn't guaranteed by hard work and innovative analysis, but it was made possible by them. What advice would you give to young people who are facing their own version of that briefing room? Situations where their capabilities are being questioned based on characteristics rather than performance. Lily's expression grew serious, reflecting years of mentoring junior officers and speaking to audiences who faced various forms of institutional skepticism. First, understand the difference between prejudice and legitimate concerns. Some skepticism is based on relevant experience and reasonable caution. Other skepticism reflects assumptions that have nothing to do with your actual capabilities. Learn to distinguish between the two. She clicked a pen unconsciously, a gesture that revealed the continued mental precision that had characterized her approach to tactical challenges. Second, prepare more thoroughly than anyone expects. When the opportunity comes to prove your capabilities, you want to exceed expectations by such a large margin that success becomes undeniable. Half measures don't overcome institutional skepticism. The advice reflected her own experience of spending months studying enemy patterns, while others dismissed her analysis, then executing a mission with such tactical perfection that her success couldn't be attributed to luck or favorable circumstances. Third, understand that proving individual capability is just the beginning. Real change happens when your success opens opportunities for others who face similar challenges. Individual achievement that doesn't create systemic improvement is ultimately limited in its impact. The observation captured the broader significance of her mission's legacy. Her tactical victory had mattered because it challenged assumptions that affected not just her career, but the careers of future female military aviators, and by extension, anyone whose potential was limited by irrelevant characteristics. Finally, remember that courage is contagious. When you demonstrate that barriers can be overcome through superior preparation and performance, you make it easier for others to attempt their own impossible missions. The room was quiet as the interviewer processed the implications of what she was saying. Lily's story wasn't just about military aviation. It was about human potential and the institutional changes that occurred when individuals were willing to risk failure in order to prove that limitations were often assumptions rather than facts. What do you want people to remember about your career? Lily considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Legacy was about more than personal achievement. It was about the changes that outlasted individual careers and created opportunities for future generations. I want them to remember that tactical thinking can overcome numerical disadvantage, that preparation creates opportunities that luck alone cannot provide, and that sometimes the most important victories are won against assumptions rather than enemies. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at aircraft that carried passengers and cargo with safety records that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of aviators. But most importantly, I want them to remember that excellence has no gender limitations, no ethnic restrictions, no age boundaries. It exists wherever people are willing to prepare thoroughly, think critically, and act courageously when circumstances demand their best efforts. The interview ended with that observation, but its implications extended far beyond the Pentagon office where it was conducted. Lily's words would be quoted in commencement speeches, leadership seminars, and mentorship conversations, where people sought guidance about overcoming barriers and achieving excellence despite institutional skepticism. Her legacy wasn't just the tactical innovations that had been incorporated into military doctrine, or the career paths that had been opened for future female aviators. It was the broader understanding that human potential was distributed more widely than conventional wisdom recognized, and that organizations succeeded when they evaluated people based on capabilities rather than comfortable assumptions. Sometimes courage meant flying alone against impossible odds, but more often, it meant raising your hand in the briefing room when everyone expected you to stay quiet, and being prepared to prove that impossible missions were just missions that nobody had figured out how to accomplish yet. Sometimes dignity didn't speak, it simply acted, and sometimes that action changed everything.